Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on deep level diversity. Before we kick off this first webinar of the year, we wanted to get some practical information out of the way. This webinar will be recorded. So we will also send you the slide deck after the recording and a link if you want to revisit this, this session of today. You'll also find a comment section. So if you have any questions, please submit and we will answer them after each presentation. Without further ado, onto a short presentation. Where's the clicker? There we go. Let me just, it's not working. There we go.
There it is.
Without further ado, quick presentation. Who is the webinar team? I am Michelle. I'm a customer success manager here at People Test Systems. So I work with clients on an everyday basis, helping them get full value out of the platform, but also their psychometric tools.
And I'm Dennis. I'm a psychologist, and at PTS, I work as a psychometrician with the main task of continuously developing, improving, and quality assuring our various test tools and features in the test platform.
And with us today, we have a special guest and also our first presenter that we are happy to share the scene with, Marie Wengler. I'll let her introduce herself, and so she can get started with her presentation on the meritocracy myth. So over to you, Marie.
Thank you so much. I'm looking very much forward to doing the talk. 2 seconds, I'll just try to share my screen. There you go. Let me see if I can be allowed to do this and overrun you. Can you see my screen? Perfect. Yeah, so my name is Marie Wengler and I'm a PhD fellow at CBS. I'm not going to go into depth about who I am. I think it's very boring to talk about myself. I'm much more happy about talking about this topic today. I'm so glad to meet all of you. I've been looking so much forward to today because we're going to talk about a subject that is very close to my heart as a researcher, namely the meritocracy myth, and you know how it can have a very crucial impact on our diversity efforts. So very briefly, the agenda of today is as follows. We have about 30 minutes together. So within that time frame, I'm able to give you a condensed rather than a comprehensive overview of the subject. So as Michelle also mentioned, please write all of your questions in the chat and I'll get to them afterwards. So firstly, we are going to look at some recent statistics related to a specific diversity subject, namely gender diversity. And then we will look a bit at what lies behind these numbers, moving on to talk about structural discrimination in recruitment and promotion practices. Then we will briefly explore the notion of biases and what that entails. And finally, we will touch upon the concept of the paradox of meritocracy. And yes, it's a very difficult word to pronounce, so bear with me. And then, of course, we'll open up for questions. So let's dive in. And as mentioned, I will start by looking at some recent statistics related to gender diversity. And that's really not to say that the other diversity variables are not as important as gender. But since half the world's population are women and gender inequality continues to persist after centuries of women's movements and legal systems and attempts to try to solve this, it remains a good starting point for any diversity discussion. I could, of course, highlight various statistics when discussing the topic of gender diversity. However, I've chosen to focus on the Global Gender Gap Index, a report I revisit every year, as the report is one of the most comprehensive of its kind. It compares all countries in the world up against one another based on various parameters related to gender equality or the lack hereof. So briefly looking at the global trends, we see that 2 parameters in particular, namely economic participation and opportunity and political empowerment, are those that causes the most trouble. And together, these parameters pinpoint that across countries, women continue to be underrepresented at the labor market, especially pronounced in senior positions, managerial positions, and parliamentary roles. And those who participate in the labor market continue to experience a significant wage and income gap in comparison to their male counterparts, carrying out and occupying similar work functions. So in other words, gender inequality in today's society seems to be a struggle very much associated with the workplace. Looking more closely at the Nordic region, stereotypically known to be the most equal region in the world, we actually see some of the same trends echoed. Comparing Denmark, Sweden, and Iceland as examples from the Nordic region, we, for instance, see how Denmark, scoring the lowest on the index of all the Nordic countries, not only struggles with a significant wage gap, but also ends up with a very low placement in the global index on women's access to leading roles in the Danish society. And I just want to pinpoint, Denmark actually used to be among top 5 countries in this index some years ago, but it's been falling steadily over the years, now landing on a 23rd place in the most recent index report. In comparison to Denmark, Sweden provides better access to women's access for women to leading positions in society. However, they also struggle with a significant wage gap. And even the wonder child, Iceland, is not without flaws. Although they have managed to fix the wage gap somewhat for similar work, they still have some challenges, although nothing compared to Denmark, when it comes to women's access to leading positions in society. So taken together, it indicates that not even the most equal region in the world is as meritocratic as most of us would normally assume. And to understand why that might be, we need to look at the barriers that women encounter in the contemporary labor. We need to look at the barriers that women encounter in the contemporary labor market. I need some tea. My throat. As the scissor effect illustrates, women currently tend to outperform their male counterparts during education. But as soon as they reach the labor market, they hit a wall. And this wall starts with recruitment and thickens all the way up the ladder, which makes it significantly more difficult for women to get promoted to upper-level managerial positions. And we refer to this as structural gender discrimination in recruitment and promotion practices. So let's have a closer look at this. And we start with recruitment and ask the question, how is structural gender discrimination expressed in recruitment? So to answer this question, I could again draw on various studies and experiments. However, due to the time constraints today, I'll focus on just one illustrative example, one of the most recognized experiments on this subject. It's an experiment conducted by Moss Rasmussen and colleagues back in 2012, and it's been replicated numerous times in various contexts. It's known as a randomized control trial, the gold standard for experiments, where all variables are kept constant except for the few being tested. In the experiment, the researchers focused on an engineering context known for the historical underrepresentation of women. And they randomly placed a sample of engineers into 2 groups. Next, they gave both groups a CV to evaluate based on various parameters. What the 2 groups didn't know was that the CV was entirely fabricated. The researchers had created an imaginary candidate with a range of credentials. And further, they did not know that they received an identical CV with only one minor difference, the name of the candidate. Because while the one group was told that the fabricated candidate was called John, the other group was told that the candidate name was Jennifer. And what the researchers found was a significant difference in how the John and the Jennifer version of the identical CV was perceived. As you can see in this graph, the John version was rated significantly more competent, more employable, and the engineers were also significantly more willing to act as mentors for John compared to the identical Jennifer version of the candidate. Additionally, John was actually also offered a higher starting salary, which we cannot see in this graph, but it's part of the experiment, which again contributes to the wage gap visible in the Global Gender Gap Index. This structural discrimination is further amplified in promotion practices. Again, I could draw on a multitude of studies and experiments. This is an area I, as a researcher, has extensively explored. But because we only have time for an overview of the subject today, I'll focus on a study by Smith and colleagues back from 2018, as it's, in my opinion, one of the most interesting and comprehensive studies conducted in recent years. And what the researchers did was that they collected no less than 81,000 real performance evaluations from real companies and examined the behavioral traits on which male and female employees were evaluated, as well as the words used to describe these behavioral traits. And they found 2 important things. First, they found that significantly more positive words were used to describe behavioral traits in male employees, while significantly more negative words were used to describe behavioral traits in female employees. Second, and this is where it gets really interesting, they found that women were negatively evaluated on traits that were positively assessed in men. For instance, certain behavioral traits were described as confidence in men, but could be described as, or were described as something like selfishness in women. And we all know whom we prefer to promote of those two, right? Especially to a leadership position. It is, of course, important for me to pinpoint that these trends apply not only to gender, but also to sexual orientation, ethnicity, age, physical disabilities, neurodiversity, and neurotypicality, you name it. Furthermore, it's crucial for me to emphasize that these various diversity variables are not isolated, but they intersect. They reinforce one another for better or for worse. So if you're a woman with another ethnicity than white, you are twice as likely to be disadvantaged when trying to enter the labor market and climbing the career ladder. If your 30s and 40s are further behind you, you're 3 times as likely to be disadvantaged. And if your brain also functions in a different way than the majority of the neurotypical population, you're 4 times as likely to face challenges entering the labor market and getting promoted to higher level positions. So even though we all want to believe that we of course choose the right candidate for the job or the right employee for the promotion solely based on merit, the truth is that meritocracy is a myth, is a big fat illusion, to be honest. The question then remains why it's so difficult for us to make truly meritocratic decisions in recruitment and promotion contexts. And to answer this question, we need to look a bit closer at the brain, specifically how our brain makes decisions. Introducing the concept of biases. You've probably heard about it. It's a pretty hot word these days, although very few of us actually know exactly what it entails and how to use it correctly. So for the sake of clarity for all of us, what are biases exactly? And to simplify it a bit, you could say that biases, they refer to these mental shortcuts that our brain automatically and intuitively use when making quick and efficient decisions. They are sort of filtering mechanisms, like a pair of glasses you take on, through which your brain perceives and understands and navigates this world. And from an evolutionary perspective, it makes a lot of sense that our brain have developed biases, because every second your brain is bombarded with millions of stimuli, informations and impressions from both our inner world and the outer world, from both our body and the external surroundings. But your brain can only consciously process about 40 of these stimuli at a time. The rest of these stimuli are handled by our unconscious thinking. In fact, up till 95% of our thinking that happens every day, every second, is unconscious, while only 5 to 10% of all the thinking we're doing every day, every second is conscious. And it's within this sea of unconscious thinking that our biases swim around. Researchers have currently identified more than 150 different biases. It's a very long list, and I'm not going to bore you with all of those biases today. So to simplify it a bit, for today, I've distilled them down to some of the most impactful biases that affect our decision-making in recruitments and promotions, negatively impacting our ability to act meritocratically. First up is affinity bias. And it refers to our inherent tendency to prefer individuals we feel an affinity towards, individuals who remind us of ourselves. This can be based on visible diversity variables like gender and skin color and age, but it could also be based on more invisible diversity variables like religion, sexual orientation, neurodiversity, social class, educational background, and length, you name it. An affinity bias often collaborates with and is reinforced by halo bias. You could probably guess from the name what this bias entails. It's about our inherent tendency to put a halo over the head of certain individuals. In other words, halo bias involves us placing certain individuals on a pedestal We're glorifying them, often based on a first-hand impression. And this means that we are much more likely to overlook any negative behavioral traits and merits in this person, which can be very crucial and have a very negative impact on our decision-making during recruitments and promotions. Another bias that often influences our ability to act meritocratically is halo bias's negative counterpart, or cousin, if you like, namely the horn bias. And it refers to our inherent tendency to again, often based on a first-hand impression, focus narrowly on negative feelings to certain individuals. We become somewhat fixated on certain behavioral traits that we find problematic in these individuals, making us much more likely to overlook any positive behavioral traits and merits in these persons, which again can be extremely problematic in recruitment and promotion contexts. So, having briefly explained what biases are, it's important for me to further emphasize that we all have biases and we cannot eliminate them. We cannot remove biases. It's physiologically and psychologically impossible to debias a brain, no matter how much smart consultants try to sell you that idea. Biases become hardwired in our brains before we turn 5 years old, even earlier, some experts believe. And we navigate through and with them for the rest of our lives, whether we like it or not, myself including. To illustrate this point, let's look at this figure. Most of us would probably agree that field A over here is significantly darker than field B down here. However, I now draw 2 lines through these 2 fields and showing you that it's all an optical illusion. Your brain is playing tricks on you. The 2 fields are the exact same shade of gray. If you don't believe me, you get these slides afterwards and you can go into Photoshop or whatever and test it, and you'll see it's the same shade of gray. The point is that after I remove the 2 lines, you'll still see the 2 fields as 2 different shades of gray. You'll still see field A as significantly darker than field B, even though I just showed you that they are the exact same color of gray. And in exactly the same way, biases operate. When you drive home today or you shut down your computer, whatever you do, you will still automatically and unconsciously navigate the world based on your biases, even though I've just explained what they are and what they do to our decision making. So we need to stop making diversity efforts an individualized matter. We need to stop trying to fix decision makers so they don't automatically and unconsciously use their biases when making decisions, because it's not working. And instead, we need to talk about changing the structural frameworks within which these decision makers can operate to ensure that we bypass biases at critical, crucial decision points, for instance, in recruitments and promotions. It brings me to my final point today, an introduction to the paradox of meritocracy. Because the more we believe that we have meritocracy in our organizations, the more we, in other words, repeat the narrative or the myth, if you like, that we of course recruit and promote talent solely based on merit, the more we paradoxically invite decision makers to rely on their biases in decision making. This phenomenon is also called moral licensing. Just like 007 has a license to kill, individuals with decision-making authority gains a license to stereotype through the meritocratic myth. Through the myth, they are mentally invited to lean back and relax, thus allowing their biases to take the wheel and make the decisions for them. And for this reason, I urge organizations to look inward and actively puncture this myth. We need to address the meritocratic myth to overcome it. Otherwise, it will continue to act as a major roadblock to our future diversity efforts. That's it for me today. Thank you so much for listening. Now it's time for questions. And I'll just stop sharing my screen so you can see me in full.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions, anyone?
I'm not dangerous. You can just ask away.
Just looking through the chat. Yeah, there was a question actually, you sort of touched upon it, that says, can you unlearn biases?
No, you cannot. You are not able to unlearn biases. It's hardwired in our brain. You are not able to, and again, I would actually say, I will not recommend, should we hypothetically say you can unlearn biases, it's not recommendable because this is how our brain functions. It functions through biases. It's our glasses that we look through. Again, they become hardwired before you are 5 years old. So if you were to hypothetically say you remove biases, we would actually not be able to navigate this world because our brain would shut down. It would completely shut down. We would be like a, gobble on the just laying around and not knowing how to actually navigate this world because they are helping us navigate the world intuitively, quickly. The problem with biases is that they can become stereotypically. So they become so good at filtering things that they actually become stereotypical. And when that happens, it becomes problematic for instance, recruitment and promotions. So no, we cannot unlearn, but we can learn to bypass them. That's my point.
Yeah, and maybe actually I can see there's a lot of questions in the chat revolving around this issue of bypassing the bias. So in order to, setting up structures as to prevent these biases from having an effect on very important decision-making processes, such as a recruitment or promotion context. Can you sort of elaborate on what kind of structures can you make or be instigated as to prevent this?
Yeah, sure. There are luckily a lot of research out there and a lot of things you can do. You can, and the great thing is that these are very simple things. It sounds like you have to completely rearrange everything. Sometimes that would be good in some contexts, but in other contexts, you can actually just solve a lot of things with small, you could say very specific targeted interventions or initiatives that you place within recruitment and promotion practices. So in terms of recruitment, you have probably heard about it, anonymized recruitment. That's one thing you can do. It's very easy. It's very simple. You can just start right there. So anonymized recruitments can be done on several levels. Let me just say it like this. For instance, you can start by just saying, well, we remove the face and the name and, educational background, even the age of the candidate in a CV. But you can even go further. And that's, of course, where I come in because I like to disrupt a little bit more. I would also recommend that you completely remove what is it called in English? The motivation and suiting. Like you have to remove completely the what is it called?
The application letter.
The application, yes, exactly. You have to remove that completely and actually replace it instead with small case questions, very specifically targeted to that job positioning question. So it means that you instead completely remove everything that could lead to biases, because most people lie in their applications. Be honest about it. We all do. That's the point. So instead of removing the lies from that context where we could maybe become biased by that, we instead, only test on the merits. We only focus on actually testing the merits via small, specific case questions. If you want to know more, I would actually recommend that you go into beapplied.com. I think it's .com or UK. Be Applied is a big platform within behavioral design, and they have developed an entire way of doing this that you can read about. So it's a good inspiration, just as an inspiration. But you can also go further in the recruitment practices and introduce structured interviewing. Most interviews today happens unstructured. You go in as a candidate and you have a chat. That's very common. We all do it. But research shows that we, in terms of, for instance, men and women, just to use that as an example, have a tendency to ask different questions. So already at that point, there's a problem because we need to make sure that we ask the same questions in the same order. And even further, we can go further and make sure that we rank the questions beforehand, so we actually know what we're looking for. So there's a lot of ways to make structured interviewing, and that alone, those two things, will help you enormously to diversify your talent pool. Then you can go to promotions, and that's a whole nother level where we can talk a lot about that. But that's just to give you a few tools.
Great. And then I think one final question around this topic was around this with the structures. One is asking in the chat, do you think AI, artificial intelligence, can help reduce bias?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you for asking that, because I'm actually planning and looking into a postdoc currently on the AI influence on recruitment promotion practice and HR systems. So that's my next step, because I'm really interested in what that can entail. Right now, what the very limited research shows, and also because, again, it's something that is in huge development. It's happening very, very rapidly. So I cannot say what it will entail completely, because everything is changing so quickly. But what it seems to be right now is that some elements of it might help reduce biases or bypass biases, and some elements and some ways of using it might actually reinforce biases. So it really depends on how they're used and how they're applied. So that's a really difficult and very interesting question that will probably become extremely relevant in the next few years, because outside Denmark, it's becoming the big trend, and in Denmark we're a little bit behind. So we can just look outside and see that these things are happening very quickly, and we have to be a little bit cautious about just being, too optimistic about technology and implementing it without, critical thinking. I think that's the most important thing for me to say.
Yes, and okay, I see there's a lot of questions for you,
So many great
Marie.
questions.
Yeah.
No, but seriously, if you have any specific questions, I'm on LinkedIn. You can always write me, okay?
Yeah, I guess there's a request for the specific name in the chat. But maybe I would like to just ask you this one. So there's a lot of questions revolving around your first bit of the presentation. So which countries have successfully demonstrated increasing equality, and also there are questions around like how this gender equality is connected to everyday collaboration and decision makings in companies, for instance. Do you know of any research or practices that have effectively dealt with this?
What do you mean by the last question? I'm a little bit unsure how to interpret that.
I was thinking if you consider sort of everyday decision making or everyday collaborations, such as what's going on in meetings and gatherings, etc. Have you looked into any kinds of possible gender inequalities in those kinds of situations?
Yes, so you can say there's definitely different levels to what we mean by inequality or lack of diversity. And as researchers, we can dig into that a lot. But in everyday situations, it's typically expressed in what we call microaggressions. Microaggressions are the more subtle part of the spectrum, and then you have overt harassment as the more extreme end of the spectrum. But we also talk about individualized diversity challenges and structural diversity challenges. So there are various different you could say levels, and you can talk about diversity challenge on. So on the everyday level, that will be what we call microaggressions, and it's really interesting to look into. I can definitely recommend you to look into that specific topic if you're very interested in that, because it's a huge topic, and we could talk just an hour about that alone.
Yeah,
and
with
regards to the first question, to actually ask the first question first about, are there any countries that have managed to do anything right? You could say I did touch very briefly upon that in terms of the Nordic region, because we are still typically known to be, the wonder children, but we are not. That's my point, is even the most amazing countries in terms of this, or the most perfect countries in terms of this, are not perfect. That's because the meritocratic myth is so inherent in most countries today. So it's something we need to break down. Even in Iceland, that probably is the first country on the list. It's the number one ranking country in the world, and they've been the number one ranking country for so many years. So they are probably the ones doing the best job, but they're also a very small population. So it's of course a little bit easier to change things around. But they're doing some really cool stuff. Yes, I would say those are the ones to look for, and also Finland actually. Sweden is a little bit lagging behind, I would say, and Denmark is completely out of the way. We cannot even compete.
Wow.
New Zealand is actually also doing some pretty interesting stuff, and they've been growing steadily over the years. You can also look at them.
Yeah, and then I guess that's a natural follow-up question. What have they done? Now you mentioned Iceland and Finland. What is it they do?
They have done so many things, and that's my point. We can talk an entire hour about that. But they have, for instance, really looked into how you can change the structural aspects, but also the legal aspects, of course. But my point is, even Denmark, we have had legal systems in place, and it's not working without also changing the structural aspects. So they and also the women in Iceland, I have to say, they are really good at making sure that they get what they want. They're really good at doing national-wide protests, which we are not in most countries, so that's probably also a big difference. But in the company, on a company level, they are doing yes, Icelandic women rock. I agree. I just saw that comment. So I would say yes, on a company level, they are doing a lot of things in terms of trying to change the structural aspects, and that's my point. That's also why I pinpointed that we can do a lot of individualized efforts, and we've been doing that for many years. The problem is when we focus on individual and we cannot de-bias a brain. That's why a lot of these, anti-bias trainings are failing. We have a 70% failure rate on anti-bias trainings. I just want to pinpoint that again, 70% failure rate on that. So it means that you should just not skip it completely, but you need to supplement it with something else. You have to, otherwise you can do as much as you want with diversity and talk as much as you want, but the problem is it will very easily and quickly become pinkwashing, and we don't want that.
I see. I can see also there are some questions around specific tips or advice on how to tackle biases sort of in the recruitment process, and we will actually get back to that.
I think you will be even better at talk about that.
we promise to elaborate on that point. You sort of set the scene very well.
That's good. That's good. I knew you're going to do it perfectly, so I'm sure I'm not going to say too much about that.
Do we have more questions?
Okay, if you are forward, we have one final question.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm sure you've expected it. What is your opinion on quotas?
I expected it a lot. I'm actually impressed it didn't come before. So I'm very ambivalent about quotas because research do show that the results are ambivalent. So I would say I can definitely see why they might be important to some extent for some years, to push a change. But the problem is they also cause a backlash. And it causes a backlash against especially those women or people of other colors or people with disabilities. We can talk about this on all diversity parameters, who becomes tokens, who are hired in to fill in that quota. And they will actually face more discrimination because they're talked as quota women or quota ethnicities or whatever it could be. And we call that a token status. And a token status will often result in higher turnovers at a higher managerial levels. So you constantly have to hire more people in to fill up that quota. So if you don't change the structures, the culture behind it, quotas will not really work in the end. And it will actually create a larger pushback and backlash. And it can also reinforce biases even more in the culture. And that's why, and the reason why that is because, as we just talked about, meritocracy is a myth, but we all believe in that myth still in most organizations. So when we introduce something like quotas, that is actually supposed to create true meritocracy, it is seen as unmeritocratic. And that paradox means that more people will, experience or pushback, or they will cause this big backlash. And even in Sweden, where they've really been experimenting a lot with this, they do not have the big success as we all believe. They actually also have had some troubles with this. So that's why I'm saying soft targets, be a little bit difficult, and be a little bit cautious about this, but also very important, go away from quotas to some extent, or just having a soft targets and be very clear about that we still focus on merit internally organization to make sure that we don't cause this backlash. But even more so, change the focus a little bit over to actually creating structural change, to actually changing, making these interventions in recruitment and promotions and making the structural change, because that will create a long-lasting change based on merit, really truly based on merit, and not just some diversity parameter. That's my opinion.
Thank
Professionally
you so
and
much.
personally.
Thanks so much, Marie. Really setting the scene for the next presentation, and Dennis will follow up. So I'll just share here the screen.
I will shut down.
Yes, so thanks a lot, Marie, for that presentation. And I guess we will try and pick up where you left in terms of you just presented how unconscious biases negatively impact various efforts to increase diversity. And now we want to touch upon a related yet distinct topic of bias, and that is the topic of adverse impact, which is perhaps somewhat less known than bias, but nonetheless a key concept in working with assessments and ensuring fairness and diversity in the recruitment context. So first things first, let's have a definition of the subject. So
Hold on, there we go.
that was now working. Okay, so adverse impact refers to a recruitment policy, a procedure, or a set of procedures that ends up underrepresenting a certain demographic group. So it's a kind of indirect discrimination in a sense. You could say it's the favoring of applicants from majority groups over applicants from minority groups. So how is this different from bias? Well, the difference is that when in this case, it's actually using a method or a criterion that appears it's the same for everyone. So it's in a sense it's fair, or at least it seems fair, but actually we end up favoring one group over another, even if we didn't mean to or intend to do so. So let's do some examples. So for instance, you will see in many job ads, many job postings, you will see a requirement on years of experience to say we want you to have 10 years experience or 20 years of experience. But in posting such requirement effectively means young candidates are not even selected or considered for the position, because very young candidates can't have that many years of experience. And so we will have an adverse impact on age. So in this case, young candidates. A second example might be requiring a certain level of education. And of course, this is sometimes impossible to prevent. I mean, being a doctor requires a medical degree, for instance. But nonetheless, we know that educational level is related to social status. So sort of enforcing or relying heavily on a demand for educational level will cause an adverse impact on social status or people of lower social status. So again, the question is, can we justify using this criterion of this educational level, or can we actually omit it for the position in question? And finally, for instance, in the military, we might have a height requirement. And what that does, as we know that on average, males are taller than females, what that will do is it will eventually end up favoring men compared to women. So we might have an adverse impact on gender. And in this case, again, the key question is to ask, can this be justified? I mean, is that a requirement to drive a tank or even survive on the field? Or does it merely reflect an outdated view of what it means or what it requires to be a soldier? So that's the key question to address. And for all of these cases, whenever we face or risk adverse impacts, the key question is, can we replace the criterion we're using with something else that is equally predictive of the work behavior we are trying to predict? So could we replace height with fitness levels or some kind of biometric measures that are more fair to both of the genders, where they are equal, so that's such that they have equal opportunities for hiring, promotion, etc. And if we can't, we need to know, is this criterion crucial or necessary enough to perform or perhaps even survive on the job in question? And to answer that question, we need to know, is the method valid? So for context, this is a graph from a meta-analysis conducted by Smedo and Schaefer in 2016. I'm sure many of you at least have seen it before. I know we have showed it a few times at least. And we have actually marked each of these 3 examples on the graph. And as you can see, neither experience nor years of education, and certainly not age, are very well predictors of job performance. So to put it in another way, with the risk of adverse impact, we don't really gain much validity or gain very much prediction at the cost, so to speak, of that adverse impact. So it's just to reinforce that in many cases, these are not the best predictors to choose. Yeah, so up until now, we have been focusing a lot on bias and adverse impact with respect to certain demographics, right? So it's all about, you could say, diversity at the surface level. So differences that are immediately visible on the surface can be seen or seen on paper, so to speak. However, research also distinguishes a second type of diversity, so known as depth or deep level diversity, you might say. Also, this is referred to as diversity of thought or cognitive diversity. So all these differences between people that lies below the surface and can't be seen, such as skills and personality, etc. And in addition to this one perspective, research actually distinguishes 2 different ideological positions as how to view diversity. So the similarity perspective, it actually originated in the US, focusing very much on race. So it's also known as colorblindedness. On the one hand, refers to the belief that people are fundamentally the same, groups of people are the same, and so differences should be de-emphasized. On the other hand, the difference approach, or the multiculturalism, actually celebrates differences and so thinks that they should be emphasized, they should be appreciated, and actually that these differences constitute a strength. So for instance, that it adds value to have both men and women in leadership positions, for instance. Whereas a similarity approach would say we should ignore focusing on these characteristics altogether. So if you combine these different perspectives into the matrix, or 2 by 2, I think in business terms, you can sort of place various characteristics on each of these 2 dimensions. And I think today we would like to raise a flag for focusing on the deep level diversity as well. I mean, obviously recognizing that service level diversity is important. For instance, female role models are important for changing norms, for instance, in leadership. Of course, everyone should have equal opportunities, regardless of their age, gender, or ethnicity. But perhaps the real value in diversity lies below the surface. That is, in having different skills, different behaviors, and different perspectives on the world and problem solving. So, question is, if we want to tackle biases and create diversity above and below the surface, what is the best way to do that, Michelle?
Yes, and that's a really good question, Dennis, right? Because we need to start at the very beginning, during and after the recruitment process, which is something that we will focus on this presentation today, and give you valuable strategies to create diversity within your organization. You can avoid unconscious bias when choosing to test applicants for a position. But it's also important to remember the other stages of the recruitment process, from job advertising to interviewing. So we would like to highlight 5 recommendations that can reduce bias in all stages of the recruitment process. Firstly, use neutral language in the job posting. Make sure to describe the job and job requirements in neutral language so that you don't unknowingly discriminate against certain genders, age groups, ethnicities, etc. Secondly, use an application form. Research shows that bias also plays a role when reading job applications. I think that we've all done it. Use a standardized application form when candidates can fill out the information relevant for the position. Anonymize candidates' resumes, looping back into what Marie was saying in her presentation, right? When reading through candidates' resumes, biases can also occur. So this is really important, right? Anonymizing the resume can eliminate inappropriate bias in this part of the recruitment process as well. Fourthly, avoid screening on irrelevant criteria. So if you use screening in your recruitment process, make sure screening criteria are relevant and evidence-based. So are they driven by job analysis, data on job performance, or culture fit even? And the last one, by using valid psychometric tests along with job profiles based on predefined job relevant criteria, you can mitigate unconscious bias and increase the likelihood of choosing the right candidate for the position that you have posted. So a structured, data-driven approach is the way to go. First of all, always conduct a job analysis at the start of any recruitment process and use valid selection methods. That is, for example, personality analysis or cognitive test, GMA, if you like. Also referring back to what Dennis was highlighting in his presentation. Discuss, prioritize, and select the competencies relevant for the position in order to have success in the job and create a job profile. Based on the competencies that you have selected, the job profile is created. You would want to validate this job profile in order to identify any biases. Is it easy or difficult to accomplish? Are there any biases on age, for example? Look also at the person-environment fit. What is the culture like at your organization? Are we missing a certain team role? Perhaps we want an analysis or we want an organizer. How does this person fit into the team? How do they contribute to and fit within the existing team and organization as a whole? Evaluate and compare your candidates anonymously based on the job profile created and other criteria selected for the certain role. Another benefit of using our job profiling tool, a match score is generated based on the competencies that you have selected. It provides you with an additional objective method, selection method. So remember still to keep focus on the requirements and relevant criteria. So we've covered a lot of perspectives on this subject today. So here we want to leave you with key recommendations. It's all about balance. Combine methods and keep an eye on both validity and adverse impact. If we solely focus on surface level diversity, we risk overlooking the value of deep level diversity. Use a job profile. It can eliminate bias and provide you with an objective method to evaluate your candidates. Be aware of your criteria selection. Ask yourself how your criteria selection is relevant for the position that you are hiring for. So why is this so important to discuss? From bias to adverse impact, to proven strategies, to create diversity, it all comes down to fairness. Avoid indirect discrimination. Do we unknowingly favor certain demographic groups, even though we think our recruitment process or methods are fair? Ensure diversity. It is difficult to create diversity if we unintentionally favor certain groups, for example, gender or age. Keep your methods just. Candidates care about being treated fairly. hence the importance of choosing valid and also fair recruitment methods. It's important to give your candidates the equal opportunities during the entire recruitment process. And lastly, according to research, professional HR practice in place has not only proven a better retention rate, job satisfaction, and engagement, but it also leaves your unchosen candidates with a better impression of your company, your brand, and might even recommend you or even want to apply again. So now we have some time for some questions. Thank you for sticking with us. And before we let you go, Dennis is going to have a little look here. And let's see. What do you have for us, Dennis?
Nothing so far, but feel free to post any questions in the chat. Maybe I would like to just iterate one point you mentioned on the general. Marie was actually pointing to it about interviewing. So it's a lot of debate about how to do interviews, and I guess the key sort of feature of the interview is the more structured, the better. It is difficult to do a structured interview, but compared to the unstructured interview, it is much less prone to biases.
Yes.
And actually, Marie mentioned the point of ranking or scoring, and that's a tricky part, right? Of doing such an interview. But actually, when you prepare an interview beforehand, you need to have sort of in place how to actually rate these questions based on answers. So based on what candidates answer, how do you rate their suitability for the job in questions, or you could say the likelihood of hiring this candidate? And if it's not done in advance, you risk that your rating ends up being biased, right? Because you become biased from the impression you get from the candidate, be it affinity bias of the person's looks or their gender or whatever surface characteristic that might interfere with your objective rating or decision making. Okay, great question. How should you weight the different candidate evaluation methods you mentioned to ensure a fair assessment? Can you not end up being biased in the way you weight, for example, a resume compared to an analysis result versus an application? I think that's a very good point. I think actually the most important thing is to do this at the offset, to have some idea of how would you weigh these inputs and what should we use them for. So if we decide on doing this number of tests, we do an interview pre-hand. At the first stage, you might do some kind of screening on certain skills or abilities and so on. And I think whatever we decide on, we need to know what are we assessing and why. And second of all, how should we rate it and do sort of a weighting in the overall evaluation of candidates. And I think the more that we can always decide beforehand, but the more we can decide beforehand, the better, because the less likely it is that we end up being biased from having met and talked to the candidates, or at least at the managers, perhaps, who usually make the hiring decisions. So I guess sort of a general advice would be to do this. And I guess also keep an eye out for how much do you want the candidate to do? Focus on what's relevant. Is it fair to ask the candidate for doing multiple interviews and multiple rounds of interviews and testing and cases and just adding a lot of stuff? That should be considered as well. Obviously, some candidates will have the better time to do so than others. So that's an aspect of fairness as well. And then the question I'm very happy to get: how do you validate a job profile to know that it's not biased?
Oh yes.
Back to your part, right? Yeah, I don't know if we can get back to it. So the key idea is that when you do a job profile in our system, you select a certain number of competencies to create it. And what we do is we actually calculate the match score for So we extract at least 1,000 cases, profiles, calculate the match scores, and then we look into are females on average more likely to score higher than men or vice versa. So is there a bias or an adverse impact on gender for that specific combination? And then you get sort of a bias indicator for gender, for age, and for job level. So then you can know, and if you use this as the basis for evaluating candidates, you know it's inherently unbiased, right? That it is fair for both men and women, for instance.
Any questions on, sorry, I can't see his screen, so I have to lean over. Yeah, I think the one, this is actually a really good question, right? That how do you anonymize CVs in practice, right?
Yeah, I was just going to ask that. I can see that Marie has shared a lot of great sources in the chat, so thank you for that.
Thank you,
Marie. As far as I know, I don't know any names, but as far as I know, there are some programs you can get on how to do this. I guess anonymizing resumes is one of those, much like the structured interview, really. That is, you could say it works very well in theory. Obviously, removing pictures, removing gender, age, etc., all these nuisance factors that might risk affecting our decision making or impairing it in a sense from the perspective of diversity is good in practice. It's really difficult to do.
but wouldn't we recommend, or something that we were also mentioning before in the presentation, that using an application form, you ask your applicants for an application form instead of them sending a CV? That would be preferable.
I mean, I can say something I know it's very difficult, of course, to just anonymize CVs out of the blue, especially if you already have a system in place. So I know some companies have tried to play around with it. Of course, you can purchase specific software that do all of this for you. But very often in most companies, you have a preliminary screening. And if you're very clever and if you cannot afford to completely change your entire system, at this very moment, one way to do it is to simply have a preliminary screening where some people screen and remove all of these things. And you can, of course, also ask the candidate not to include it, but some candidates will still do it. And that's the problem. Sometimes they just do it because that's the usual way of doing it. And some systems also will not allow you to, send an application without also sending all of these things. So there are some system challenges as well. But let's say you ask the candidate not to send it, or they still send it. You simply have a separation of those who are supposed to evaluate these candidates, and then you have some who do the preliminary screening, and even manually, if that's what it takes, change it, remove it. And I know some who have actually done that, and it's very efficient. It's a very good way of doing it just to get started on this practice. And it doesn't have to be very expensive in the beginning. Of course, there will be the optimal solution is to have a specific software that does everything for you. But if you just want to get started and try it out, you can even do a pilot. That's what I often recommend. Do a pilot test. Compare 2 periods or 2 recruitment processes where one you actually do this and one you do not do this. And then you compare it against one another and you see what happens. I promise you'll be very surprised of the talent pool and how it looks, because very often we know that it's some sort of manager who will at the end be the one who decides something. And if you make sure that you remove everything before the manager gets this in his or her hands, that's just a very good way of doing it in the very beginning. So again, getting started, I'm not saying you have to solve everything right now, but just getting started on these practices and getting used to it. Then you can always invest in some fancy software afterwards.
Thank you so much, Marie. And with those words, we will be wrapping up. I know that you've sent amazing material over in the Q&A session. We will make sure to also include that when we send the email. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. If you, we have some reports that we will also send the newest one, Why Testing Matters. All of you, thank you so much for joining. Thank you for now, and see you next time.
See you soon.
Bye now.